BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Are we getting more depressed, maybe even stupider, as we eat less and less fish and shellfish, less leafy vegetables, less meat from animals and poultry that have been reared naturally? Well, some research points that way. In this edition of the Food Programme, I talked to a scientist who a long time ago predicted our current mental health crisis. Have a listen. It's hard to go into a supermarket these days without spotting at least one label boasting about its omega-3 content. But long before it became a staple of food marketing, a British scientist was uncovering what he believes is the real story behind why these essential fatty acids matter, particularly for our brains. And they're called essential because we have to eat them, as our bodies can't produce them. In this programme, I'm meeting one of the great scientific provocateurs of the last 50 years, Professor Michael Crawford, now in his 90s, to hear how his research began, why he champions food from the sea and fresh waters as brain food, and how he thinks we can increase our fish intake without harming the planet.
All the things that we're doing on land we'll be doing in the sea. I'm not talking about farming salmon in cages or any fish in cages. I'm talking about what the Japanese and the Chinese and the Koreans are doing, planting seagrass, planting kelp, and planting these artificial reefs.
We'll also hear from chef and broadcaster Rick Stein, who's long admired Professor Crawford.
I always put it down to the fact that we're always being assailed by end-of-the-world stuff. It's just personally, obviously, having a real interest in food and nutrition that I'm particularly involved with my brother about omega-3.
Rick Stein. Professor Michael Crawford has published more than 300 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 3 books, all challenging conventional theories of human evolution. I went to meet him at his home in North London. In his large sitting room cum office in a vast Georgian terraced house that he bought for £21,000 in the 1960s, that's now part of one of London's millionaires' enclaves, there are early primate and humanoid skulls scattered on his desk and bookshelves. He calls it the cat's room, in honour of the strays stalking around us that he and his wife have rescued. As we watch the cats, we start our conversation about what their brains need to work well. Well, it turns out feline brains aren't so different from ours. In fact, it was while studying the brains of 32 different mammals that his groundbreaking research really began to take shape.
We were interested in, what was the difference in brain size in all the different animals. And it turned out that the chemistry of the brain was identical regardless of what species you were looking at. Everywhere else in the animal, in the liver, the muscle, the kidneys, the lipid chemistry, the fat chemistry was totally different. But the brain chemistry was pretty identical. And that told us that the things that were making the brain were really rather important for it and led us to the significance of docosahexaenoic acid, omega-3, the marine food web in human evolution. That's how it all started.
But what about his own beginnings? When did his interest in science start?
I was born in Edinburgh when the war broke out, and I can remember to this day listening to the radio, hearing this voice saying that we have declared war on Germany.
This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room.
The government decided to ship all children out of the cities, and we were evacuated to go to school all the way up to Fort Augustus in Inverness-shire. And that's where I started school at the age of 9.
In reception areas, schools should be reopened as soon as arrangements for the education of the children evacuated to the locality can be completed.
It was a wonderful school experience, and they taught us all sorts of things, including how to fish. We had lessons in cooking and all about food and nutrition and things like that. And I was really entranced by the professor of physics who was a Polish professor, and there was a lady, a Miss Dunlop, who taught chemistry. And they were both hugely charismatic people, and they sold me science. Even after I left school, Miss Dunlop sent me a book on chemistry because she knew that I was interested in going to university and studying chemistry, which I did in Edinburgh.
Then came national service, and Michael joined the Royal Air Force, where he learned to be a navigator over the snow in Canada. After returning to the UK, marriage, and a move to London helped by his sister, the film actress Anne Crawford.
We went out to dinner one night with Larry and Viv, Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh and John Mills and his wife. Oh, those were the days.
Once he had a doctorate in chemical pathology, Michael wondered what was next.
Everybody wanted to go to America because that's where you were supposed to go in those days. But Professor Sir John McMichael, he was head of medicine at postgraduate medical school, he said, we really need somebody to go out to Africa. Oh? And he just said, the most interesting thing about East Africa is that they don't have the sort of diseases we have. They don't have cardiovascular disease. They don't have colon cancer. They don't have breast cancer. They have a lot of other things, but they don't have these things. And he said, it's really important, somebody like you, to go out there and try and find out what's going on. So I went out there by ship.
That seemed to be the great change point in your life, going to Uganda and trying to find out why they didn't have those diseases.
Well, it opened my eyes to nutrition. The genome was the big thing. Watson and Crick was a recent discovery. We'll be living forever kind of stuff. The hype was phenomenal. And I went out to East Africa with that hype in my mind. And it suddenly, very quickly, began to realize just how important nutrition was.
There was heart disease in Uganda, but of a particular kind with a particular cause.
The commonest cause of death from heart disease was endomyocardial fibrosis. Basically, what happened was that scar tissue formed in the heart, and it almost certainly formed because of degeneration of the heart, which was put down to chronic malnutrition. At its simplest, you could say that in Britain, you had lipid or fat malnutrition because we were eating the wrong kind of fats. In Africa, they had protein malnutrition, which was quite recognized.
This was all new thinking in the 1960s. The idea that diet had anything to do with disease was widely scorned all over the West, but particularly scorned in the UK. And even in 2025, it's an idea that the medical and scientific establishment still struggle to take seriously. But it was this research that led Michael Crawford to setting up a laboratory in London, where eventually he and his colleague Andrew Sinclair made their discoveries about the importance of omega-3 fatty acids and the brain. Revolutionary stuff, and not well received by large parts of the medical and scientific establishment.
There was a huge amount of antagonism, actually still is. The first thing we discovered was, studying 32 different mammalian species, that the chemistry of the brain had obviously been highly conserved since the beginning of the evolution of the vertebrates. And a major component of the signaling units of the brain was occupied by a fatty acid called docosahexaenoic acid. DHA. And the source of docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, the head of the omega-3 family, if you like, was in the marine food web. And that really opened a whole bunch of new doors. It opened a bunch of doors about mental health. It opened a bunch of doors about how humans evolved.
The idea was that humans had evolved on the savannah, right? And you were saying, no, this is not possible.
It would be impossible to have evolved a brain that we had on the savannas of Africa without DHA. Just impossible.
For 40 or more years, the accepted crucible of humanity was the open savanna grassland of Africa, and the aquatic alternative was ridiculed.
In 2005, David Attenborough reported on the history and current status of the aquatic ape theory of evolution in the two-part Radio 4 documentary Scars of Evolution.
Then, really, since the early 90s, the consensus began to fall apart. Why? What new evidence has come to the fore in the last 10 or so years to cause such a paradigm shift? To drive the anthropological mainstream off the savannah and, with a certain amount of pushing and shoving and cautious hesitation, down to the water's edge.
The only way Homo sapiens could end up today with 2% of his body mass as brain would be to find an ecological resource that would provide him with the nutrients that are required for the brain to grow. And the only place you can do that is at the coastlines.
Professor Michael Crawford stirring up more controversy there, speaking to David Attenborough in 2005.
So this bloke comes along, this chemist, you're a chemist, and you come along and you say, evolutionary theory is wrong. Humans did not evolve on the savannas. They evolved around water sources, rivers, and the sea coasts. And as you said, that there was a lot of hostility. What happened?
Letters in the Times for a start.
Crawford's views on evolution remain outside the mainstream, but his research focusing on the vital importance of maternal nutrition has been globally influential.
This is quite a touching subject because one of the things we reported on in 1976 was the composition of human milk, because we knew the composition of the brain at birth, and in the Lancet we had shown how these fatty acids in the mother were concentrated by the placenta so that the blood that's circulating in the fetus was specifically enriched with DHA and another fatty acid, arachidonic acid, both of which are essential for the brain. So we then realized that quite clearly maternal nutrition was of fundamental importance, perhaps even before conception. So it turned our attention to breast milk. And of course, it was full of docosahexaenoic acid. And we did studies in 7 different countries, and they were basically all very similar profiles in terms of brain-specific essential fatty acids. And we reported all of this, and it was picked up by the World Health Organization and Food and Agriculture Organization, who held an international expert consultation on the role of dietary fats and oils in human nutrition. And they reported on all of this. And after that, it became apparent that there were people who didn't like it, people who made formula for infants, for argument's sake.
The backlash, Michael says, led him and his colleagues to lose a big funding application.
There was this resistance. I mean, we weren't the only ones. I mean, at the same time as we reported on the DHA in the brain, Jean Anderson was reporting on the importance of it in vision. And Susan Carlson picked up that cudgel as well, and the importance of nourishing preterm infants in particular with the right kind of fatty acids as well as all the other stuff that they need. And essentially it had to reach the point where people had to study experimentally with preterm infants what we already knew from experiments in rats and rabbits and things like that. And they showed in preterm infants that if these fatty acids were not given, the Retina Foundation in Dallas said that you lost 1.5 lines of visual acuity in the eye chart. And then there was cognitive losses as well, by comparison with breast milk. And it wasn't until 1992 that a German company, Malupa, started putting arachidonic acid in infant formula.
It was, in fact, in 1993 when the German company added omega-3 to infant formula. All infant formulas sold in the European Union and the UK now has to include DHA, a big shift from when Professor Crawford and his colleagues first demonstrated how crucial this was for the development of babies. It's a message he's been repeating for decades. And we've covered this story on the food programme since the late 1980s. But by 2004, it broke through to a general audience.
The conference on fat is taking place in Brighton this week. Now, this time it is not about obesity, but good fat, the kind we need to stay healthy. Apparently, diets have changed so radically in the past 100 years or so that we're not getting enough of the omega-3 fatty acids that we need for our brains to develop properly. The consequences, according to scientists, could be as serious as hyperactivity, mental retardation, even suicide. And meanwhile, we're getting too much bad fat, saturated fat, the sort that kills us. Professor Michael Crawford of London Metropolitan University is organising the conference. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So where do we get these omega-3? Is it just oily fish?
Well, actually it's all aspects of the seafood chain, but the oily fish happen to be the richest source. The point here is that the brain first evolved in the sea 600 million years ago. And despite all the changes in evolution, it is absolutely stunning that the ancient molecules that were used, these omega-3 molecules that were used to build the very first brains, are still used today, both in your visual system and your brain. So it's a very highly conserved molecular structure. We have to get it in the diet one way or another, and the best source of it, obviously, is still the marine food chain.
Professor Michael Crawford speaking to John Humphreys on BBC Radio 4 in 2004.
I think when I first came to interview you with Derek Cooper, when I first started working at the food programme, what astounded me was your predictions. You said that a diet low in omega-3, in the two fatty acids, had resulted in circulatory diseases, stroke, heart disease, and would, the next wave, you said, would be mental problems, the brain. I mean, you've just written a book called A Shrinking Brain.
Yes.
And you're saying the brain has shrunk.
Well, it has. Yes, it has shrunk, yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous. You see, we started off with a 340 cc cranial capacity as a chimpanzee or something like that 5 or 6 million years ago. And it sort of crept up to 1,450 cc's with the people of Herto, which was in Ethiopia. And at the time, they would be living beside the sea. And the evidence of reached a peak in Cro-Magnon between 28,000 and 32,000 years ago, of somewhere in the region between 1,500, with an absolute top of 1,700 cc cranial capacity. And when the decline started, is anybody's guess, but Lee Broadhurst was one of our co-authors in America, works at the USDA. She says that it almost certainly began with the beginning of agriculture, when we started moving away from the coastal regions.
Michael Crawford's theories on the reasons for our shrinking brains is just one of many alternative hypotheses. Today, there are more researchers expanding on the foundations Professor Crawford laid, exploring the intricate links between nutrition, brain health, sustainability, and the future of our food systems. One of them is Dr Anneli Löfstedt, post-doctoral researcher at the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at the University of Oxford.
And essentially, we wanted to map the UK seafood supply chain to see what is being produced, what's being imported, exported, and how this relates to actually what we're eating and what we should be eating for optimal health. So compared to other food sources, the UK is largely self-sufficient in many other food products. But although we're an island nation, the UK is a net importer of seafood. And even more fascinating, I would say, is around about 80% of the seafood that we consume in the UK is made up of 5 species, known as the Big Five. And this is your cod, haddock, salmon, tuna, and prawns.
So what do we catch here and send elsewhere, and what of the Big Five do we bring in from other countries?
So in terms of exports, our biggest exports are salmon, followed by mackerel, followed by herring. And then regarding our imports, we mainly import the Big Five. We do produce a small proportion of cod and haddock, but otherwise they are being supplemented by imports from abroad. Interesting when it comes to salmon, we do produce a lot of salmon in the UK, but we also import a lot of salmon. I believe Scottish salmon is more expensive. So we're actually swapping almost our salmon that we produce in Scotland with that produced in Norway. So really interesting there. And then again, when it comes to tuna, another one of our big five, we import all of our tuna. And then, yes, when it comes to our mackerel and herring, we do produce those, but as I mentioned, we export the majority of those oily fish species.
So what connects your work to the work of Professor Crawford is that you were looking at how good certain fish and seafood are for us, nutritionally speaking, bodybuilding. How did you do that?
So after mapping the UK seafood supply chain, we took it one step further and we actually mapped the nutrient flows. So we could establish what nutrients are leaving the UK via fish exports and then what nutrients are entering the UK via imports. And interestingly, we found that the UK experiences large nutrient losses from seafood exports. Mainly, we're losing a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin B12s and vitamin D through exports of our salmon, our mackerel and our herring. And actually retaining more of these exports of oily fish for domestic consumption could contribute more to achieving the European recommendation for omega-3 fatty acids. So this is up to 73%, but also recommended intakes for vitamin B12, which is up to 46%, and vitamin D up to 7%, which actually could benefit population health in the UK.
Did your research actually uncover what impact this is having on our health as a whole population?
No, is the answer. I think it's important to, perhaps emphasise, though, that the cod and haddock, for example, they are a lean fish or a white fish, so they are richer in iodine compared to other sources. Our salmon and our tuna, these are oilier fish, so they are richer in these omega-3 fatty acids. And then prawns are actually a really good source of other micronutrients, such as calcium, iron and zinc. I think it's just about, we should really be diversifying our seafood consumption in terms of trying different species as well, and also just eating fish locally.
Dr Anneli Löfstedt from the University of Oxford. According to research by the Marine Stewardship Council last year, less than 1 in 5 people are eating even the minimal NHS-recommended 2 portions of fish a week. But could our oceans really sustain any more fishing? Overfishing, whole species being hoovered up by fleets of giant trawlers and put under threat of extinction, is one of the major issues of our time. How does Michael Crawford deal with the contradiction between what he sees as our need to eat from the marine food chain and this painful reality? Is it our brains or our planet?
Simple, we farm the sea. 10,000 years ago, when land-based food became a little bit difficult, what did they do? I'm sure they had an expert committee that sat round the fire at night and said, all right, we'll invent agriculture. And they did. Now, if they're intelligent enough 10,000 years ago, faced with this food problem on the land, surely today we must be intelligent enough to realize that the next opportunity is farming the sea. I'm not talking about farming any fish in cages. I'm talking about what the Japanese and the Chinese and the Koreans are doing and other people are doing in some parts of the world. They have cleaned up the seabed, planted seagrass. They have grass pastures for the fish, the way we have grass pastures for sheep and cattle on the land. They have artificial reefs to encourage the development of the marine flora so that the marine food web gets enhanced. The wealth of opportunity is phenomenal for a new industrial revolution, a new agri-industrial revolution, by using our coastline and our what was traditional use of the marine food web.
More than 15 years ago on the food programme, Michael Crawford sounded optimistic about cleaning up the seas around us and our rivers.
We've got to address the whole business of how we use the rivers, the estuaries and the seas. What we've actually got to do is to clean up the rivers. The present game of capture fisheries is hunting and gathering. It's a 100,000-year-old mentality. It's about time we realised which century we're living in, and we started using our abilities to agriculturalise the estuaries, the coastlines and the oceans. And we've got to start by cleaning up the estuaries as they're doing in China and Japan.
But we don't seem to have learned from those examples. What happened?
I don't know. I've no idea whatsoever what's going on in the mind of people who are supposed to be responsible for governing this country. We need to, who's ever responsible for our fish and whoever is responsible for agriculture and whoever is responsible for health and whoever is responsible for education to put their heads together and to come up with a policy to deal with the pollution of our rivers and our estuaries, and to deal with our coastlines. The extraordinary thing is that the benefits from this are so enormous. It is the only thing that's going to stop the decline in mental health, the decline in IQ, and the road to extinction. It's the only thing that's going to stop that. Now, the other thing is, it has benefits outside of what we're talking about. Because kelp can be eaten, kelp can be fed to animals, kelp can be used as fertilizer and was always an important fertilizer to put trace elements back into the heavily used soils. And we can't grow any more rainforests. But we can do that in the sea with kelp, because kelp forests fix CO2 in exactly the same way as the rainforest fix CO2.
We contacted the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, who told us, cleaning up our rivers, lakes and seas for good is a key priority for this government. We have taken immediate action, including 2-year prison sentences for polluting water bosses, banning unfair bonuses, and 81 criminal investigations have been launched. We're also committed to protecting and restoring our oceans to good health, and the government this week announced it's reviewing the protections that are currently in place in marine protected areas, including the use of bottom trawling. Well, the chef and broadcaster Rick Stein, who you heard at the beginning of the programme, has spent decades talking and writing about the benefits and the pleasures of eating seafood and of protecting our fisheries. He's known Michael Crawford for many years through his brother, Professor John Stein at Oxford University, whose research has parallels with Michael Crawford's on the role of omega-3 in optimal brain function. I wondered at the oddity of both brothers being in the fish business, but in such different ways. How had that come about?
We came at it at different directions. I mean, we both spent a lot of our childhood in Cornwall and ate a lot of fish, mackerel in particular, and sprats. But I think it's just coincidence. We have had quite a few joint ventures. I would attend speeches, conferences, and cook oily fish for the gathered people. And I've always had an interest in the health benefits of fish generally, because as probably my brother John said, that what your grandmother said is that fish is good for the brain, which indeed it is.
When you started making TV programmes about fish and seafood in the 90s, was anyone interested, were commissioners interested in that scientific side of fish?
No, not at all. My first TV series was in 1995. There was just a sort of a feeling that fish was really underused and under-enthused about in the country. So it was more from a joy of eating point of view. And it was only latterly when I realised my brother was researching into the effect of omega-3 on the brain that we decided to link my enthusiasm with his understanding of why it's vital for us human beings to consume fish.
Can you remember when you met Michael Crawford? It was the other...
Well, I'd met him quite a few times just in sort of meetings with my brother. Latterly, the last series I did, Food Stories, I actually interviewed him. And it was just really great to have the director, Matt Bennett, agree to film him. he's got a sort of slightly optimistic view. I mean, his big thing is that we can farm fish on seagrass.
It's interesting, isn't it, that in one of his early books, Michael Crawford predicted what would arise if we kept going on eating these diets very low in omega-3. He said, first of all, there would be circulatory, heart disease, strokes, those kind of problems. And then the second wave would be an epidemic of mental health problems. And of course, every word of those predictions turned out to be true.
Absolutely. And I think it's the second half that is particularly scary. I mean, the first half is also, but, there does seem to be a sort of epidemic, as you said, of poor mental health in the world. And it's almost like we ascribe it to, the internet or sort of the way we live now, rather than something obvious, like we're not eating the right food. I did do a little experiment with John, my brother. We went to a young offenders prison near Edinburgh called Polmount. And John rigged up an experiment with a small number of young offenders, giving half omega-3 tablets and the other half placebos. And it was an attempt to sort of show that with a healthy diet of omega-3, the behaviour improved. And I actually did a class cooking oily fish in the prison. And one of the guys I'd cooked for, I did a raw fish dish, said, that's disgusting, I couldn't eat it. He did eat it, and he's now a famous chef in Glasgow.
Chef Rick Stein. And he wouldn't tell us the name of that Glasgow chef. In that small experiment, Rick said, they gave prisoners at a Young Offenders Institute supplements containing omega-3. Well, similar experiments have been done on a larger scale in English prisons, double-blind studies where none of the prisoners knew whether they were getting supplements or a placebo. The results among the prisoners on the supplements were startling, cutting rates of violence by nearly 40%, while there was no change in the behaviour of those taking the placebo. We documented one of those studies on the food programme. So are supplements part of the way forward, an alternative to food from the marine chain?
It's better than nothing, let's put it this way. But fish and seafood is not just fish oil. Let me give you an example from biochemistry. There are two types of fat in the body. One is the fat that's around our waistline, subcutaneous fat. That is the thing called triglycerides. The other determines the structure and function of every cell in the body, including the brain. And that is structural fat, or it's mostly what we call phospholipid or phosphoglycerides. Now, if you look at oil is a triglyceride. It's this sort of fat.
Michael is grasping his midriff. Yes, go on.
Well, that's what the oil is. Cod liver oil contains about 12% eicosapentaenoic acid, or EPA omega-3. And about 8% DHA omega-3. You go to the cod muscle, and a lot of people sort of turn their noses up at white fish and say it's all to do with oily fish. That's rubbish. If you look at cod muscle, the muscle doesn't contain all this triglyceride stuff. It contains structural fat. And the structural fat is made up of 47% DHA, and very little of the other fatty acids as well. So the difference between supplements and eating the fish itself is very, very large in terms of nutritional validity. And moreover, of course, oils don't contain the trace elements like selenium, zinc, copper and manganese are absolutely vital for the brain.
But we can have neither the oils nor the trace elements if we don't find a better way of feeding ourselves from what Michael Crawford always calls the marine food web. And for him, that means, as he said, farming the oceans, the seas, and the rivers. What that means in practice, he wrapped in 2 stories, he told us, about working visits he made to the Middle East and Asia. The first, 30 years ago.
I was invited by the Japanese government in 1990 to do a lecture tour of Japan on the importance of the marine food web for the brain, and hence the importance of Japanese culture. and maintaining Japanese culture, because they recognized that there was the beginning of the westernization in the big cities in Japan, and they were worried about that. At the end of this, there was a meeting. The minister asked me to explain what I'd been talking about. I'd been on television in Japan, all kinds of things, gave a lecture at the Yamaha Hall, and he said, tell us the nub of what it is you've been explaining to people. So I did. And after I'd finished, he said, thank you, Professor Crawford. Thank you for explaining to us why we should agriculturalize the oceans. And that's what we're going to do. And that's what they started. So that's how it all began, with my thinking in terms of really what we should be doing in response to this. It was 1990. And as they now have this operation between two islands, which employs all the fishing people, and they have research facilities and all sorts of stuff, and it's a huge, huge thing.
I saw in your biography that you'd done some, what sounded like very interesting consulting for Oman in the Middle East, and, which is desert. So what happened?
I had a student from Oman, a PhD student, and I got to know the people in Oman, and they invited me to be a scientific advisor to the government, which ended with an international conference on the importance of fish and seafood to the economy. But the Sultan asked us, what am I going to do after oil? So I told him, I said, well, it's very simple, really, Your Majesty. You've got desert on one hand and ocean on the other, so the answer lies in the ocean. And then I wrote a report on the importance of the increase in diabetes and all the rest of it and the change of the food system, and that they've got to get back to their traditional things with developing marine agriculture. And the first step in that would be planting artificial reefs and seagrass. Well, since then, they've planted 350 hectares of artificial reefs. And they sent me a video of this, and within 2 years, there were fish coming and eating, nobbling at it and all this kind of thing. Quite wonderful demonstration of how fast productivity can be enhanced by the use of these artificial reefs.
I mean, I have to say this, this is a bit personal, but here you are, you're early 90s now, are you?
95 in July.
It's clear that your memory is excellent. Do you think this is down to a lifetime of eating fish?
Oh, I've had a misspent youth. I don't know what it's down to, but we do eat a lot of fish. There is so many different things in the larder from the oceans, including seaweeds, including mussels, including cockles and whelks and molly malone or live, all that kind of stuff. The marine food web is so rich in diversity that you could have a different meal practically every day of the month.
But do you?
Well, no, not quite, no, but we have pretty well a different fish meal 5 or 6 times a week.
So, Professor Crawford, we've just established that you're about to be 95. So what's next for you professionally? It's not long since your last book came out. What next?
We're planning a very large study at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital to bring in greater depth and detail the relationship between maternal nutrition and neurodevelopment, and particularly because when you look at the details of neurodevelopmental disorders, there are quite a lot of different types of developmental disorders. And we don't know if they all have the same etiology, the same cause, or whether they have specific or different reasons. And so that is what we're really going to be studying over the next 10 years. And we're wrestling with the planning of this at the moment.
What most concerns you now in 2025?
What concerns me now is the future of humanity. Because I have children and they have children. What's going to happen to their children is a very scary thing, the way it's going. The problem I really have is a complete and deep concern about the fact that this evidence has been known and predicted since 1972 when we first put out the challenge. And it's not just us. across the board in the scientists across this world that know about these things. They're all of the same opinion. And yet, nothing is being done.
Is there anything now that makes you optimistic? Do you feel any sense of hope?
Well, maybe I can be optimistic that if this program grows out and somebody listens to it, they'll actually begin doing something. Let's be optimistic, yes, I'm hoping about that. Because it is the most serious threat to the children of our children. It is.
Professor Michael Crawford. His book, The Shrinking Brain, is out now. But before we go, a reminder that we're looking for your nominations for this year's BBC Food and Farming Awards. The awards are all about celebrating the people and businesses who are shifting the realities of our localities, our economies, our world, in fact, through food and drink. Whether it's a remarkable local baker, a pioneering drinks producer, or someone using social media to inspire us to make better food choices, we really want to hear about them. There are 7 categories this year, including Best Food Producer, Best Drinks Producer, Best Street Food and Small Eatery, and the Farming for the Future Award. You can nominate in as many categories as you like, and it only takes a few minutes. Head to bbc.co.uk/food awards to read all the details, including the terms and privacy notice. Nominations close at midday on Monday, June the 30th, so don't miss your chance to help someone gain the recognition they truly deserve. Thanks for listening. I'm Sheila Dillon, and the programme was produced by Natalie Donovan in Bristol. If you like it, well, why don't you give us a review, and maybe even give us a review if you didn't like it. Interesting to hear.
This is Dr. Chris. And Dr. Zand here, and we are dropping in to let you know about our new BBC Radio 4 podcast.
In What's Up, Docs, we are going to be diving into the messy, complicated world of health and well-being, because it can be confusing, can't it, Zand?
That's right, Chris. The mass of information out there can be contradictory, it can be overwhelming, and Chris and I get confused too.
That's right, we get seduced by the marketing, the hype, the trends, so we want to be your guides through it. And I think it's fair to say, Zand, we are going to be getting personal.
We're absolutely going to be getting personal, Chris. What I want to do is bring in my own health dilemmas in the hope that we can help you with yours.
Listen and subscribe to What's Up, Docs on BBC Sounds.